For this lab, we're going to be getting into our very first full body system. And it's one of the more challenging ones, so you'll want to take some time to really get to know the different parts. We're going to get to know the cardiovascular system. In your lecture, this is split between two different chapters, so you'll want to combine those two together to get a full understanding of this body system. There are many moving parts, including a heart that has a lot of different structures to it that you'll be required to know, so make sure to sit down with this one. The lab, however, will combine both of those chapters together, looking at the cardiovascular system as a whole. So let's introduce ourselves to our first body system, the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is made up of the heart, blood, and blood vessels, all working together to help transport things like nutrients and waste throughout the body. Things like nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, urea, and other waste products have to be moved around from all the different tissues we have throughout the body. We don't just move things around, although transport is one of our main functions that we see listed here. We also serve to help regulate things like body temperature, as well as defend against pathogens, things like bacteria and viruses that can be harmful to us. Let's get at the biggest piece of the cardiovascular system, the heart. This is our major organ of the cardiovascular system, and you're going to be required to know many structures found within the heart. Our heart is what we call a four-chambered heart. Compare that to other organisms that may only have 2 or 3 chambers, but ours is completely separated 4 chambers. 2 of those chambers are called atria, or atrium if you're talking about one, and the other 2 chambers are ventricles. So let's look at the outside, the exterior of our heart. This is the anterior side, meaning it's the front side, versus posterior, which would be the back. You're going to see a lot of terms, a lot of names of structures on this image. Before you get kind of freaked out over it, you're not going to need to know every single structure of the heart. Anatomy class will take care of that for you. But we do want to get familiar with at least the major structures. So let's talk about some of these blood vessels and chambers we can see from the outside. We have a superior and inferior vena cava. These are blood vessels that are going to return blood from the body to the heart. So we're bringing blood into the heart through both of these. We have the right atrium right here. We have the left atrium over here. And the left and right ventricles. Now, once we see the interior, you'll see the septum that divides these 2 ventricles away from each other. But in this case, we're just kind of looking at the region. We don't have any sort of indication on the outside that divides the 2, but generally speaking, it runs about right through here. So we have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Now, you may have noticed that right and left seem to be reversed. And there's a reason for that. When we're looking at any organ, any part of the body, when we're referring to right and left, we refer to those points from the perspective of the person who has the organ. So if you're looking at it, you're looking at the right atrium and it appears to be on the left. But if you were to put that heart inside of a body, the right atrium would be on that person's right side. So our rights and lefts will always be flipped, where things labeled right are going to appear to be on the left when we look at that object, and things on the left appear to be on the right when we look at that object from the front view. So just that's kind of a little hint as you go forward. If you have to identify left from right, especially here in the heart, you will have to know right from left for those atria and ventricles. Just make sure to pay attention to that. If you ever get lost, just remember the vena cava are connected to the right side of the heart, right, to the right atrium. So you can use that as a reference point if you're a little bit confused right now on your left and rights. Some other things we see on the outside, we see pulmonary veins on each side and pulmonary arteries. Now, another thing I'll point out here is that A lot of times people like to say that veins are oxygen poor and arteries are oxygen rich. And for the most part, that does hold true. However, it's not always the case. We'll talk more about that when we get to the arteries and veins, but I want to point that out that in this case, the veins are red, meaning they're oxygen rich, and the pulmonary arteries are blue, meaning they're oxygen poor. We have connecting to the pulmonary arteries is the pulmonary trunk, this large blue vessel here. And then coming up and around in red is the aortic arch, which is going to be part of the aorta. If you were to just call this aorta, I would not dock you any points. Right? But it is one piece of much larger extension downward that all makes up the aorta. Servicing the heart muscle itself, we have some blood vessels that are running all over the surface of our heart. So it's important to note that the blood we find inside of the chambers when the heart's pumping does not actually feed the muscle of the heart. We need blood vessels to feed the heart muscle just like any other tissue needs blood vessels to bring blood to them. And so we can nourish the heart and remove waste from the heart using cardiac veins, which are here in blue, and coronary arteries you see here in red. I won't be too nitpicky on the naming of the individual coronary arteries and cardiac veins, but you should be able to identify them in general, knowing that this is a coronary artery and that this is a cardiac vein. And then down here at the bottom, this little pointed part, we call the apex, right? Because comes to a point. Now let's look at the inside of the heart where we see more moving parts. Again, you're not going to have everything from this image down, so don't panic just yet looking at it with all of these labels. But there are some things that you do want to know and recognize that we see on the inside that we cannot see from the outside. First, I want to point out the left and right ventricles. Now we can actually see them as two separate entities because we have this septum here in the middle. So a septum is always going to divide something. Think like the septum of your nose. So this is the septum that's going to divide our chambers, right? Our left and right ventricles. We also see that on the inside of this heart, we have various valves to help prevent backflow of blood. And so we have right here the pulmonary valve, or also known as the pulmonary semilunar valves. There is an aortic valve hiding behind it, right? And it looks the same as this one, so you could call it the aortic semilunar valves or the aortic valve. And then we have these two different looking valves over here. So these ones, the pulmonary and the aortic ones, are semilunar valves because they look like little half moons. But over inside the ventricles, dividing the ventricles from the atria, we have a different kind of look, right? And we call them AV valves, atrioventricular valves. So the name tells you what it's working with. Atrio, meaning atrium, ventricular, talking about the ventricles. So this is the valve that divides an atrium from a ventricle. And on the right side, we call it the tricuspid valve. And on the left, we call it the bicuspid valve, also known as the mitral valve. If you use any of these terms, right AV valve, tricuspid valve, or if you're talking about the left AV valve, mitral valve, bicuspid valve, I will accept those since they are all appropriate terms. But you don't want to mix them up. So make sure you know which ones go with which side of the heart. The rest are things we've already pointed out, so I'm not going to necessarily go into detail on those. But let's talk through the list of the things we should be able to identify. We should be able to identify from an image the aorta, the superior and the inferior vena cava, the left and right atria, the left and right ventricles, the septum, both AV valves, tricuspid and bicuspid, both semilunar valves, pulmonary and aortic, the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary arteries, the pulmonary veins, what a cardiac vein is, and what a coronary artery is. If you have these things down and you can pick them out from a picture that has no labels on them, then you should feel very comfortable with the heart. Again, I'm not going to get into some of the more difficult structures that we're not really getting into in this class. But if you have this list down, especially if you're moving on to the next level to anatomy, you should feel fairly comfortable when you do go on to that next level. So now that we've looked at the different structures of the heart, let's talk about how blood flows through the heart. The heart is a one-way road. Blood will only go in one direction through the heart. If it doesn't, then we have an issue. And that can lead to various conditions. We're not going to get into any sort of conditions in lab, so I'm going to leave those for lecture. But let's talk about how blood flows through. Now I have this image over here, and I have various arrows with numbers. These numbers correspond with the steps I have listed over here on the left. So let's start with step 1, of which there are 2 number 1s. The inferior and the superior vena cava are both going to dump blood from the body into our right atrium. So we're returning blood from the body to the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava, and we enter into the right atrium as our first heart structure. When the right atrium contracts, meaning it squeezes, that's going to push blood through our AV valve, through our tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, right here. So we've gone through the tricuspid valve into our right ventricle. The right ventricle will then contract and squeeze and send blood up through our pulmonary semilunar valves, through the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries will carry blood to the lungs. We don't see them here. That's why we see them called pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. If you see pulmonary, you should think lungs. So our pulmonary arteries carry blood to the lungs. The lungs will then oxygenate that blood. We're going to add in new oxygen. We're going to remove carbon dioxide in the lungs. And then we're going to circulate that blood back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Right? So we have the pulmonary veins down here in red. Pulmonary veins are going to bring blood back and push that blood into the left atrium. The left atrium then contracts, pushing blood through our bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. This left ventricle then contracts. It's large, it's very muscular. If you notice, the muscle wall is a lot thicker. When it squeezes, it pushes blood through the aortic valve into the aortic arch, which it'll then go and distribute through various arteries to the rest of the body. And then once the blood has gone through the body, it cycles back to the inferior and superior vena cava, and we start the process again. So if we notice this blood flow pathway, the right side of the heart, its primary goal is to send blood towards the lungs for oxygenation, and the left side of the heart takes that blood received from the lungs and pushes it out to the body. So we call that the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit being handled by the right side, where we send blood to the lungs, and the left side being the systemic circuit, since we're sending it to the rest of the body's systems. That helps you remember that. So now we're going to get into those arteries and veins. Now I mentioned earlier about the pulmonary arteries and veins and how a lot of us think of arteries as red and veins as blue, and for the most part that tends to be the case in the pictures we see in our books. However, it was not the case when we were looking at the heart, where the arteries were shown in blue and the veins were shown in red. And it's because it's not a great way to actually define arteries and veins. We do not, and I mean do not, want to use the oxygenation or the color to define arteries and veins. That would not be correct. The proper way to define arteries and veins has to do with whether or not we're carrying blood from or to the heart. So we're talking about the direction of blood. Arteries will always move blood away from the heart. Whether it's oxygenated or not does not matter. We're moving blood away from the heart. So remember the A's. Arteries move blood away from the heart. The veins move blood back towards the heart. And again, oxygenation does not matter. Color does not matter. Veins are bringing blood back to the heart. There's some other key things that can differentiate between arteries and veins as well, besides just the direction that we're pushing blood. In the arteries, they're under a much higher pressure compared to the veins. Veins are under low pressure. And because that high pressure, they have to have a thick muscular layer. So we see that in the image here, right? We see that this red layer, which is the muscular layer, is very, very thick in the arteries and is very, very thin in the veins. Right? These arteries have to be able to handle higher pressure. They have to be able to kind of push back and be able to stretch and move a bit in response to the blood pressure, whereas the veins don't have to handle that so much, so their muscular layer can be a lot thinner. The arteries have a much more narrow space on the inside. We call that the lumen, and so that's going to be a much more narrow, smaller, versus the veins where it's a much more open space on the inside. And then lastly, we look at the valves. We look at the artery, it just goes straight through. There are no valves, but our veins do have valves. Those valves are going to help prevent backflow of blood. Since the veins, in a lot of cases, have to fight against gravity, but there's not a lot of pressure to help fight that gravity, the valves help prevent the backflow of blood again. You'll notice that we have a lot of things, a lot of tricks and structures in place to prevent backflow of blood. It would not be helpful if blood were to collect and pool down in your feet, for example. That'd be very dangerous. You'll want to be able to compare arteries and veins against each other. Know the similarities, like they both are going to move blood around, they both have muscle, they both have an internal layer of endothelium, they both have connective tissue surrounding them, but also know these differences in terms of how much of a muscular layer they have, what kind of pressure are they under, do they have valves or not, what direction are they pushing blood, and what does that opening look like. You notice on the in-between we have these purple vessels that we call capillaries. Capillaries are going to be the blood vessels where we actually exchange that material. So the capillaries are very, very thin. They're very, very tiny. Very tiny. And so we're looking at like 1 cell thick, tiny. And they're that way because we want to be able to exchange the waste and the nutrients with the tissues. By making them really thin compared to the arteries and veins, the capillaries can exchange things back and forth. Now let's look at what's on the inside of those blood vessels, the blood itself, which is made up of 2 parts. Remember that blood is a connective tissue, if you remember that from histology, where we have a matrix that's non-living and the cellular component. The plasma of blood is the non-living matrix, and the formed elements is what we call the living components. The blood actually does a lot when it comes to the functions performed by the cardiovascular system. The blood vessels in the heart, their main job is to just transport things around, move things from one place to another in general. But the formed elements are going to perform a lot of the other functions that the cardiovascular system carries out. They do transport things like nutrients and waste, and that would be mainly carried out by the red blood cells, also known as the erythrocytes. Erythro meaning red and cyte meaning cells. But protection and regulation come from the white blood cells and the platelets. The white blood cells, also known as leukocytes, are primarily responsible for protecting us against pathogens, things that can cause disease and infection in us. And the platelets, known as thrombocytes, are going to prevent us from losing blood. So if you were to get a cut and you were bleeding, your platelets would stop that blood loss. They would patch up any holes in the blood vessels to prevent any blood from getting out. So let's look at the red blood cells and white blood cells, which are commonly shortened to RBCs and WBCs. Again, red blood cells, their primary job is transportation. They're going to move oxygen, carbon dioxide, waste, nutrients, and so on and so forth around our bloodstream. Their main job is to attach to oxygen to transport it around. And in order to do that, we have a protein called hemoglobin found on the surface of the red blood cells. The white blood cells, like I mentioned earlier, are primarily for defense. They're part of our immune system. Now, we're not going to get into all of the different types of white blood cells right now, but know that there are several different types of which you will need to know the basics. You will need to know the basic function of basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. All of them help provide defense, but they contribute in slightly different ways. For example, the neutrophils are going to be our first responders. They're the first white blood cell to respond to any sort of invading pathogen, and they do so by engulfing or phagocytizing those pathogens, where they engulf them and destroy them on the inside. Platelets are involved in clotting, which could be a form of regulation. If you are injured, then we start a clotting process to stop blood loss. And there are a couple proteins that are used in order to do this. Proteins prothrombin and fibrinogen are used to create a net. These two proteins will get activated to become thrombin and fibrin. Once they're activated, they create a sticky net that will catch other cells like red blood cells to create a scab or a clot, and that's how we stop ourselves from bleeding. If someone doesn't have these proteins, or their proteins are for some reason damaged or have been made incorrectly, that can be part of a condition that we call hemophilia. Someone with hemophilia would not have the ability to create those scabs or clots and would lose blood excessively if injured.